Good morning, everybody. I know you're all very busy, so I think I will make a start. I'm Dee Moran, and I'm the Professional Accountancy Lead in Chartered Accountants Ireland. And welcome to this webinar on the practical considerations of implementing the European Single Electronic Format, or ESEF. We feel that this has been coming for a long time, as it was originally to apply to relevant companies for financial years beginning on or after 1 January 2020. The impact of COVID-19 last year and questions regarding the electronic format statements resulted in a lack of readiness amongst preparers. The European Parliament and the Council of Europe agreed to allow member states to delay implementation by 1 year, providing they notified the Commission of their intention to do so and outlined their reasons. Following engagement with impacted members, we in Chartered Accountants Ireland made representations for this extension, which the Minister kindly applied for and was granted. And this was very much welcomed by members. It's hard to believe that it is 12 months on and we are now shortly looking to implement it. Like any new process, there have been many questions asked about ESEF and its implementations. The Financial Reporting Lab, part of the UK FRC, conducted research on reports which were created for 2020 financial statements. And this webinar focuses on their findings. I'm very grateful to my colleague, Mike O'Halloran, who will provide the background on ESEF, and to Thomas Toomsey-Smith, FRC Lab Project Director, and Carleen Konings, FRC Lab Project Manager, who will present a summary of the research. This webinar is focused on the practical implementations of ESEF, the issues encountered by those who implemented it last year, and also tips to make the process easier. The slides will be made available after the webinar, as will a link to the full FRC Lab report. And please use the Q&A function on the bottom of the screen for any questions. We will try to answer as many questions as we can, and we will take away any questions to which we don't have the answers. Please just use the chat function for any technical issues. Please also note that this session is being recorded and will be available to anyone who was unable to make it today. So many thanks again for joining, and I'm now going to share the screen and hand you over to my colleague, Mike O'Halloran.
That's great. Thanks very much for that introduction, Dee. I suppose just while you're sharing the slides there, as Dee has said, my section, I'm just going to look at the background to ESEF, and then Thomas and Carleen will bring us through the content of their recent ESEF report. And I suppose just by starting really just to go through, well, what's the purpose of this webinar? I suppose the first thing is just to help you prepare for mandatory digital reporting. Obviously, for financial years commencing on or after the 1st of January 2021, there's a new requirement to prepare financial statements in the format required. And with the new requirements such as ESEF, there are obviously going to be new challenges that will be encountered. There'll be new deadlines that need to be met, new communications that need to happen, and new expectations that need to be managed. And I suppose it goes without saying, the process of finalising and approving financial statements, it was always driven by tight deadlines, and adding a layer of tagging and Xhtml file preparation, will place some additional strain on those deadlines. It's also to highlight some of the challenges and pitfalls faced by ESEF, and we're delighted to have Thomas and Carleen from the FRC Lab here with us today. And we're also very fortunate that they've prepared their recent report on ESEF reporting, as it allows us the opportunity to see, well, what were the key issues that arose in their study, and hopefully by raising those issues, it allows preparers the opportunity to be prepared for what can go wrong, so that issues can be avoided for 2021 year ends. We're also hoping to obtain some of their insights into their early implementation study. I'm not going to go into detail on what was in Thomas and Carleen's report, but I suppose some of the points that do jump out, are things like tagging errors, design errors, the lack of a test run on tagged items, and certain instances where there was, I suppose, a lack of review in place of the document and of the tags. So hopefully from their input, we'll be able to learn from the lab's report. And we're also here to answer any questions that attendees might have on ESEF. And today's session, I suppose, it's focused mainly on the technical tagging requirements. I know there are some, I suppose we might term them open legal questions that are being resolved at the moment. But we mightn't have all the answers today, but please do send in your questions, and if we can't answer them during the session, you know, they'll certainly be beneficial in any event. So I suppose on the next slide, then we just have the background to ESEF. You know, who does it apply to? It applies to Irish companies whose securities are admitted to trading on a regulated market in the European Union. As regards the effective date, it's mandatorily applicable from the 1st of January 2021. And as Dee mentioned, there was a deferral obtained so that the original commencement date was meant to be the 1st of January 2020, and a year-long deferral was achieved last year. It's worth noting too that there was the option to voluntarily prepare your 2020 financial statements under ESEF. So the requirement then, you know, all issuers who are within the scope of ESEF are required to prepare an annual financial report in Xhtml format, and that format will make the company's annual financial report machine readable, and it'll replace the current PDF format. And furthermore, if the issuer prepares consolidated financial statements under IFRS, then they'll also have to be tagged using the ESEF taxonomy. It's worth noting too that, you know, it's a phased approach, as we'll see in a couple of slides' time. There are some tags in the initial year in 2021, and then there's additional slides added then in 2022. And I suppose if we were to look at, well, what's the objective of ESEF on the next slide, then you know, it's ultimately transparency on what's being disclosed in financial statements, and so there's a single structured electronic format for EU annual financial reports. And it's also that the information in those financial reports is machine readable and is comparable then between entities. And I suppose if you're looking at one of the ultimate objectives here is that there's better and more comprehensive use of companies' financial data. The applicable taxonomy that's to be used is the ESEF taxonomy. I think the 2020 ESEF taxonomy is the version applicable at the moment. And then in future years, obviously there'll be increased tagging for the 2022 financial year end, and, you know, the ESEF taxonomies will be updated then as time goes by. So then we've, I suppose, a very basic timeline of ESEF in Ireland on the next slide. And, you know, in May 2019, the delegated regulations on the use of ESEF were published by the EC. As we've already mentioned, on the 1st of January 2020, that was the original planned effective date for ESEF. And as Dee already gave the background to, in February 2020, there was an extension granted by 1 year. So that on the 1st of January 2021, and that's the revised effective date. And then from the 1st of January 2022, that's years commencing on or after the 1st of January 2022, there's going to be additional tagging requirements, as we'll see on the next slide. So again, I suppose if we were to look at it in phases of phase one for periods commencing on or after the 1st of January 2021, there's a requirement to tag the figures in the primary financial statements, and there's also some specified mandatory tags in the taxonomy. And then if we look a year down the line, we'll have the same tags, the primary financial statements, some specified mandatory tags, and then there'll also be some block tagging of the notes as well. So all the notes will be required to be block tagged. And I suppose if we look at the challenges or the potential challenges and potential concerns of ESEF, you know, and we'll see from Caroline and Thomas's from the report, it's not going to be a simple outsourcing exercise. It's not going to be something that we can, you know, send to a third party, which we can then assume will be returned to us error-free. You know, there needs to be an appropriate amount of testing carried out to ensure that the tagging happens correctly and that they're error-free. And we'll see from Thomas and Caroline that some of the weaknesses noted in the report was, I suppose, a lack of review of information that was prepared by the outsourcing third party. So there just needs to be that layer of review of the tags. Reporting it will only be useful if the tagging is high quality and appropriately reviewed. So when we look at the goals of the regulation that we discussed a couple of slides back, those goals will only be achieved if the information is accurate and there's a sufficient level of quality control involved in the process. When we look at the auditor's role, obviously there'll be a requirement on the auditor to audit the tags, so do things like check for errors, ensure that the mandatory tags are tagged, etc. But I suppose more significantly that there will be a bit of deadline pressure within the auditor's role, because the tagging will likely happen towards the end of the process, or will happen towards the end of the process, and then those tags will be required to be audited. So I mean, that could potentially cause delay if, for example, errors are identified when they're being reviewed or when they're being audited, and they need to be corrected and remedied. Deadlines, we've already discussed. It is a time-sensitive time of the year for companies, and now there's a new process to learn, a new process with a couple of additional layers from previous years. So it's maybe a process that companies had become used to, or it had become part of the routine. Now there's a number of additional steps added to it. There's maybe new people involved in the process, or there's maybe the same people doing different things. So that would be obviously a bit of a challenge. There's the use of a third party obviously always presents a bit of a challenge. And even if we look at things with our auditor's hat on, I know this isn't an audit session, but when there's a third party involved, we need to be sure that the work performed by that third party is appropriate. We can't automatically assume that the work we're receiving from the third party is complete and accurate. And I suppose we also need to be aware that the service provider could be providing the same service to companies with a similar deadline. So we just need to be sure that they can meet our deadline, and that deadlines are appropriately communicated with that service, with that third party. So I suppose it's important for entities to engage with the third party as early as possible, make sure the timelines are understood, and just to know who's preparing the document and who's doing the reviewing, and all those details are known and understood. And obviously there's more costs and resources required. I suppose more specifically the resources, and just making sure you have the right people in the right place at the right time. So I suppose that's a lot of my introduction and my background to ESEF. And I suppose just on the next slide, we just have highlighted the FRC Labs, their recent report, the report that they carried out. They looked at 50 early structured reports from across the UK and Europe. The reports were either voluntary filings or originated from EU countries where the requirements had already come into force. And the report sets out the findings of the review and highlights some key considerations for companies. So I know that Caroline and Thomas, they've got some working examples of how ESEF may look in practice, which obviously is very useful, and we're obviously very grateful that they could be with us today. So I think first up we have Thomas. So just over to you, Thomas. Do you want to maybe start just by giving us an introduction to the study, and maybe bring us through what you're going to be covering today?
Sure, thank you very much, and thank you all for attending today. So just to give some context and reminder as to who the FRC is and who the lab is. So the Financial Reporting Council is the UK regulator focused on accountants, auditors, corporate reporting, corporate governance, and in the UK as well, we own the UK's digital reporting taxonomy. So this is the taxonomy that companies use in the UK to report to our business register, and HMRC, the tax authorities. And we also help create the taxonomy for the Irish Revenue and Customs as well. So the FRC itself has a kind of general interest in making sure that corporate reporting is of good quality and meets the needs of investors and users. And as part of that overall objective, the FRC Lab was set up about 10 years ago to create a space in a kind of non-regulatory way that could explore issues and topics that were important to companies and investors. And so this structured reporting implementation study sort of fits into a narrative and a series of reports that we've been doing over the last 5, 6, 7 years, looking at various aspects of the technology. So we looked at XBRL reporting just as the idea of ESEF was coming into place. And we looked at blockchain, we've looked at artificial intelligence, we've looked at virtual reality and augmented reality, and the use of video, as well as websites. And what we learned through thinking about all of these different things and factors that will be changing the way that companies report is that they're all interconnected. So they build upon each other. And at the base of all of those is really having good quality structured reporting in order to feed all of those other exciting and innovative ways of doing reporting. So, you know, we really see this structured reporting requirements as a key building block of the future of corporate reporting. And whilst the kind of current requirements are very much focused rather minimally on the financial statements and the primary statements and then sort of block tagging for the notes, it's going to quickly come for much more detailed sets of information across the reporting. And you're already seeing, you know, in the Commission's proposals around ESAP, so European Single Access Portal, and some of the work they're doing on ESG, is that people are already identifying areas. So what's really, really crucial is making sure that this first step on our kind of digital journey is done correctly and is done right. And I think the risk here is, and if you look at the United States, where they've had structured digital reporting for sort of 10 plus years, it took 5 or 6 years of quite hard work before the quality of the reporting was sufficient in order to drive up the use of the information and data. And we don't really want to have to spend that long, you know, making sure that happens in our kind of jurisdiction. So, you know, whatever can be done to sort of improve and drive up quality is crucial. So that's really why we decided to look at this this year. If you could move on to the next slide, that would be great. Great. Well, as was discussed, so our survey or our review, we took 50 files. So across the EU, and the UK, there was a mixture of companies and countries who had voluntarily decided to do tagging, and those where it remained mandatory. So particularly Germany, for example. So we selected 50 files out of around about 700 that had been filed across the EU, and we picked those files that were required to do the full ESEF package. So that means companies that had consolidated financial statements. So we didn't look at the ones where it was just a single XHTML file, where they didn't have the consolidated statements. Now, what we did, we looked at them under a number of different aspects. We reviewed the look and feel of the file. We compared it to what was up on the website. We looked at through several viewers to see how it worked. We looked at the quality of the tagging. We looked at issues and concerns that it raised with us. We looked at the validations and sort of automatic testing that could be done. And across those different pieces, what we felt was that even though for many areas it was voluntary, what was out there was significantly falling short of the quality that generally people would expect for a company's official filing. So across our sample, more than 70% of files had tagging errors. Half of them at least had usability errors, and sort of 25% had sort of significant design issues. And, you know, I have been a preparer. Colleen, my colleague who will be presenting also, you know, she was a preparer. So we know the care and attention that companies spend on their annual reports to make sure that they are perfect. And very many of these issues appear to have been because that care and attention didn't necessarily translate into the electronic form. And I think, you know, particularly with any new requirement, and particularly where it's full of lots of, you know, technical acronyms, which unfortunately XBRL and ESEF is full of lots of technical acronyms, which, you know, attach onto another area that are already full of lots of acronyms, being accounting and reporting. It makes people, you know, feel that perhaps it's a technical area, perhaps it's something to do with tax, and maybe their tax department should do it. They think it's something that they can, you know, outsource the responsibility for. And, you know, frankly, it's not. It's something that, you know, now sits at the heart of the corporate reporting process. And so what we wanted to do was highlight some particular key areas where we think there could be areas that people could learn from. I mean, if we could move to the next slide, please. So the sort of 3 areas we looked at was process, tagging, and usability. So my colleague Colleen's going to take us through the usability and tagging, but I'm going to cover off the process. So it kind of boils down really to some factors and some decisions. So the factors and things that you might want to consider really is around making time to understand the requirements and making sure that the right teams are involved. Now, again, because of the way that these requirements work, there are a number of pockets of information that companies need to read and understand and comprehend. So that it will be the ESMA information, which is obviously the manual, and all of the supporting material that they put up. And just to flag, they've released their sort of latest version of their taxonomy this week. So they've put some new stuff up. You have to understand your kind of local jurisdiction and what the requirements are there. And then if you also have a listing in another jurisdiction, you also need to consider what their requirements are. And you need to obviously understand the combination of all of those alongside your own processes and procedures. And actually that's where a lot of the complexity lies, because it's really think about your timetable when your board directors are around, what your process is, what's your normal standards, and thinking about how those apply in this digital world. And I think one of the things we were surprised at when we started to look at how it was working is that you don't always get the answer that you would expect when you start to look at the requirements and legislation and how they interact together. So really making the time to get people involved and up to speed before the year end is absolutely crucial. The next element is around picking an approach and service provider, and I'm going to touch on that in a second. But the third really area is around testing. We absolutely recommend that people test the files before the year end. Test your process before the year end, test the file before the year end, test the final file through any of the testing facilities that you can, because it's going to iron out the issues. And frankly, this is going to be a timely, time-consuming process. You just have to pick where you want that time to fall. So the more testing you do before your kind of crunch point, the less time that's going to be out in that kind of crunch zone. And as a preparer, I think my kind of phrase or motto was always, the difference between a crisis and a process is timing, and this really applies in this case. And then there's an element here around setting up the governance process. Now, different companies will have different approaches, and we've certainly seen those when we've looked and spoken to people about the reporting. But I think the crucial factor here is there is some education that is going to be needed for boards, and putting a set of XHTML tagged documents in front of people and asking them to look and sign off some kind of odd tag things, unless you've prepared them for that is going to be a tricky process. So spending the time up front to educate people is key. So then thinking about the kind of 3 key judgment areas, and this sort of particularly attaches to this identifying an approach. So the timing and workflow, company involvement and design. So timing and workflow, there are a number of different options, and we've seen these across the reports that we looked at. Some people have sort of bolted on the ESEF process. So they've run through their normal process, they've had the design, and then they turn that design into a XHTML file, whereas others have run a parallel process. So they've looked at sort of tools and techniques to kind of run a process that kind of creates one model that is both digital and electronic, and we will see some examples of those. And those have different benefits and costs, and they also have different timing implications and different quality considerations. And we think as well that people's approaches will probably evolve as they get more comfortable with this. So in the UK, for example, our expectation is that most people are going to probably do a bolt-on for the first year, because it sort of fits most neatly into the process. But some of the more interesting files we've seen have been done in this kind of parallel process. So that just kind of gives you a sense there. Company level of involvement. So we've seen, and particularly where there's been tagging for companies that have US listings as well. Now, over time, what they've done is they've gone from a more outsourced model where they've outsourced the tagging to bringing it in-house and having those expertise in-house. Again, both approaches work, but they need to be thought through and considered. And I think particularly the audit element is interesting here, because we've heard from auditors that there's often 5 or 6 terms between what the they are initially given and what eventually gets signed off. So being able to have that robust discussion with the auditors about the tags, why the tags have been selected, working through the errors and issues, means that you kind of need a lot of expertise in-house in order to be able to do that. So just a factor to think through. And then designs. We've seen sort of 2 main types. Some companies who've sort of strip back the annual report to much more of a compliance-based approach in order to make this tagging more simple, and those who want to retain that kind of quality annual report and have done a full design approach. And there's kind of points in the middle there as well, where companies have decided to sort of simplify but still keep a kind of good looking annual report. Again, those are all decisions that you have always made as companies, but it's having to remake them and re-justify them for this digital world. So if we can go to the next slide, and my colleague Colleen is now going to talk us through some of the usability and appearance issues.
Thank you, Thomas. So yeah, the ESEF format is really intended to be that single format that serves both human readers and machine readers. And so our review covered both sort of aspects of file quality. So we looked at the usability and the appearance of the files for a human reader, as well as the tagging. So starting off with that human readable layer. So if you open up a file, it basically looks like a web page. So it can be opened in any browser, and it can actually look exactly like a highly designed PDF, which we've seen in some of the filings that we looked at. But we definitely also saw some files where the human readable layer, when you open it up, it seemed like no one had really paid much attention to it, and there was like text in the wrong places, and there were bits that were unreadable, and especially when there were sort of more complicated graphics with different layers, it sometimes looked very weird in the ESEF file when you compared it to the PDF. And you can sort of wonder, well, because most companies we've seen sort of continue to produce a PDF alongside the ESEF format. And if that PDF looks fine, then why does it matter that the human readable layer in the ESEF file looks weird? But we think it's important that in the ESEF file, it's sort of, well, those issues that appear there will be clearly visible to users of the file, and sort of may negatively affect their perception of the quality of the file as a whole, including the tags and the data that sits underneath, and might make users reluctant to use the digital information. So that's why we think you should also pay some attention to the human readable layer of the file. And so, as Thomas explained, we think most of the issues that we've seen sort of come down to an attitude to the file. So some companies may not yet be appreciating that the ESEF file is really the official version of their annual report going forward, and they just haven't applied that same sort of care and attention to the ESEF file that they apply to the PDF. And sort of practically, because we've also spoken to lots of design agencies and sort of software providers in this area, they tell us that the issues that we see with design usually appear when people have just designed a normal PDF, and that has then been converted into the Xhtml format, but they haven't done that design initially with the conversion in mind. And that's where these issues then pop up with the design. So either you need to sort of, in your design process, take into account this conversion, or later on in the process have sufficient time to fix any issues that come up. And so if we look at the next slide, for companies that are relatively new to this, it's well worth looking at some examples of filings submitted by other companies. So as Thomas mentioned, in the longer term in Europe, there are plans to have this sort of central repository, the European Single Access Point. But in the meantime, XBRL International have sort of built this quite helpful free website with basically all of the ESEF filings so far that they could find. So if you go to filings.xbrl.org, you'll see this list of files. And if you open up the files, if you click on that view column, that will open up the files with an inline XBRL viewer. So we have an example of that on the next slide. So what that means is that it sort of opens up. So on the left-hand side, you've got the HTML version that you can see, but you can also sort of see and interact with the underlying tags that are in the document. So most of these viewers, you'll be able to like highlight all of the bits of information that are tagged. So for example, here you can see in green, they've highlighted all of the numbers that have been tagged in the income statement. And then when you click on the bits of information, you can see what tag has been applied. And you can also see some sort of meta information about the tag, including also the references to the underlying IFRS standards. And so the advantage of that sort of is that you can open up the file, but you don't really need any specific software to do that. It's sort of built into the file, this viewer. And so, yeah, it's quite helpful for companies that are just sort of starting out or that want to have a look at sort of their peers tagging or their peers design of the file. Also, if you actually click on the link that we've got here, it opens up the report and you can sort of scroll through and you'll see this one is actually quite a nice one, quite a highly designed one, that where the front half looks quite pretty. They've still got the nice graphics in the front half. And so in the report, we also recommend that companies put a version of their ESEF file with such a viewer inside it on their website to sort of improve the accessibility of the file and the usability. So then if we go to the next slide on the tagging. So in our report, we really try to emphasize the point that the tagging is not simply a label matching exercise. It's about ensuring that the accounting meaning of the tags you select sort of match the accounting meaning of the information you report and sort of what IFRS requirements that information satisfies. And so that's also coming back to our point that you can't fully outsource the tagging. That's because you really need that sort of in-depth knowledge of what information is being reported in your accounts and sort of what IFRS requirements that information satisfies to be able to select the correct tag. And of course, there will be situations where you will need to create so-called extensions, which are custom tags. So that's when there's no suitable tag available in the core taxonomy, the company will have to create their own entity-specific tags. And that is quite normal because applying IFRS standards, you'll always end up disclosing some entity-specific information that's material or some entity-specific disaggregation of information. So tags are not necessarily a bad thing that should be avoided at all costs either. You should create extensions when necessary, but you should also not deliberately try to avoid them, because we've seen in some of the files that some companies sort of shoehorned some of their disclosures into tags in the IFRS taxonomy, seemingly to avoid extensions. So there's sort of a balance there. And then in the report, we also have a sort of list of some of the common tagging issues that we've seen that companies should be looking out for. A very common one is the signs that you use for the amounts that you report. It's quite tricky because the sign you need to use is not always the same as the sign that's on paper, but we have some guidance in the report. And then one other thing that we heard quite a lot when we spoke to, when we did our outreach around this topic, was that people were sort of struggling with validations of the reports. So that means, many of the different national repositories, as well as software tools, will carry out these sort of automatic checks on the files. And so when you're a preparer or an auditor, you'll come across these sort of warnings and errors that will be thrown up by these validation checks. And so what we've heard was that, especially in that first year, preparers and auditors weren't sure how to deal with those warnings and errors. Do they need to be eliminated, or is it acceptable to have some? And so in the report, we try to clarify that errors, you'll have to get those really indicate that there's an issue that you need to address, but warnings sort of indicate that there's something unexpected about the file, but there may be a valid reason why there is a warning, and you can leave that warning in. Especially, we've seen sometimes there are warnings caused by sort of rounding and things like that. So warnings are messages, it's worth investigating them, what the underlying cause is, but it is acceptable to leave some warnings in the file as long as you are satisfied that there's no underlying issue. And then finally, on the last slide, I just wanted to talk about the next steps. So we are planning to continue supporting companies in producing high quality filings. So next year, when that batch of mandatory filings comes in the UK, we will be looking together with the FCA in the UK at the quality of the files and the need for any additional guidance. We also, in the UK, recently wrote a letter together with the FCA to the CEOs of companies that are in scope of the requirements to remind them of their responsibilities. And just this slide also summarizes that there's sort of different aspects of quality that we'll be looking at. So there's the technical quality of the files, but that's usually something that the software tool should be taking care of. That's more of like a hygiene factor. And then there's the accounting quality, by which we mean, have you selected the right tag, which is something that you probably won't be able to check automatically. And then there's a sort of usability and communication aspect of the file. And another piece of work that we will be starting to look at next year is sort of the use of the data. Especially speaking to companies, we've heard that some of them are sort of questioning the benefits of the exercise because they can't immediately see any evidence of the use of the data by investors and other users. So we are planning to do some work on sort of how the data could be used, if there are any challenges that we as regulators need to be addressing to sort of realize that full potential of the data. And we sort of generally expect that over time, the interest in the data will grow. So in this first year, because it's only the primary financial statements, that is data that most investors will already have through other sources. For example, the data aggregators that they have licenses for. But going forward into that note tagging and potentially in future other information like ESG information, we think that's where investors and other users will get really interested in this data because it's not available from other sources at the moment. So yeah, that's all I wanted to say. I'll hand back over to Dee, I think, for the Q&A.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Thomas and Caroline. I think that just gives us a really good sense of, some of the issues that have arisen, but some of the practical tips also. And I would encourage anybody who is involved in this to have a read of the report, because it really does contain a lot of research and a lot of examples, which hopefully may help you. And I think just as I said, we will share the slides, but I certainly will myself look into that that website and the consolidated reports, because I haven't seen a lot of these either. So I think that'll be really useful. So thank you very, very much. So just a couple of questions in, and for the kind of non-technical, I am also joined here by Daniel O'Donovan from KPMG, who is chairperson of our Audit and Assurance Technical Committee in the Institute, and also by Fiona Hackett from PwC, who is chairperson of our Financial Reporting Technical Committee. But I think, I just get my questions here. Okay. Fiona, I might just ask you the first question, actually, and it is there a chance that the primary financial statements only derogation could also apply to our year 2 being the 2022 statements?
Thanks, Dee, and just to start off by thanking Thomas and Carleen from the FRC. That was very, very useful presentation and lots of food for thought there. The question about whether there might be a derogation. So as we know, it's only the primary financial statements and certain additional notes this year, but it's the whole IFRS consolidated financial statements next year. I don't think we could see a derogation delaying the whole tagging exercise for another 12 months. The original derogation came from the European Commission / EU, and there hasn't been an equivalent derogation made available in relation to delaying the additional tagging for another 12 months. So I don't think that's something that we can kind of count on or rely on coming. So I think that it is a case that we have our reduced level of tagging this year, and we will have the full suite of tagging next year.
Okay.
Maybe I can just add to that as well. I mean, because I think we hear quite a lot of misunderstanding about the second phase, which is the notes tagging, and people assume quite often that it means the entire note. So tagging all of the individual numbers, tagging all the columns, tagging all the text. So this is block tagging. So this is basically just saying this note is about this topic, and there is quite an extensive list of these topics. But if you can handle the process around tagging the primaries, the note tagging is straightforward. It's much simpler than people often expect. I think people often think as well that this primary statements piece kind of means that they can only do the XHTML in the primary statements as well. And again, that's not correct. So it's the whole annual report is in this XHTML format. Just the tagging is applied to these individual pieces. So this first year actually is the real bump in terms of process. After that, it's actually much more straightforward.
Agreed, Thomas. I think it's fair to say as well that this first year is the year where there is the potential for the most judgment in terms of applying the appropriate tags and extensions, and it's the one where I think the areas that you've identified in your work, this is where the majority of them might arise if they're going to arise as well.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Fiona and Thomas. Thomas, I think the next one is for you. Can you advise the file size limit when submitting the XHTML file? As we understand, this is limited to a relatively small file size.
So unfortunately, it's every national storage mechanism has their own limits. So you're going to need to check with your filing mechanism, which if you're dual listed could be difficult, right? Because different you might pass one and actually your other listing might not accept it. I mean, what we have seen is these files that can be pretty large, and there are ways of making them smaller. So I would definitely speak to your provider to get a sense of how big your file is going to be beforehand. Don't leave it to the last minute, because you don't want to fail because it's too big.
Sure. Okay, great. Thank you. Daniel, I might just get you maybe just to comment on the next one. As the auditors are required to report on the ESEF tagging, does this require tagging is completed at time of approval of financial statements, so date of audit report?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just step back, Dee, in terms of answering that question and just lay out how sort of that all hangs together from a Companies Act perspective for an Irish company. So the statutory financial statements under the Companies Act must be prepared in accordance with the accounting framework. The accounting framework is defined in the Companies Act as being the applicable accounting standards and the sort of relevant law, which would include the ESEF regulations. So therefore, the statutory financial statements are the tagged financial statements as you were. So at the time the auditor approves the audit report, they do indeed have to have completed their audit work over the tagged financial statements. So yes answer, very straightforward.
Great. Thank you very much. And Thomas or Caroline, for the next one, I think, will block tagging of the notes require a separate tag for each individual note? Don't mean figures within the notes, but therefore will they require an extension for each note as note 1, note 2?
So there's quite an extensive list of tagged items in terms of these blocks tagging. So they should cover your notes. We wouldn't find it unusual for anyone to block tag, create an extension for a block tag. What you probably might find is that when you get to the structure of your notes, kind of raises some kind of practical challenges for you, because you've split the bits across different notes, or they're the way that you create them. So one of the things we're planning to do next year is look at and spend some time thinking about how best to structure notes to sort of work within the kind of block tagging context, because it does raise some questions. So we're hopefully going to put some sort of best practice out next year on note tagging. That might help answer. Colleen, you might have a more technical answer than me.
No, I have nothing to add. Thank you.
So yeah, Thomas, maybe somebody just wanted to know, on the companies that you reviewed, did any have a dual listing with the secondary listing in the EU regulated market? And was an audit opinion required in these circumstances?
So we did. So we definitely had some files that had dual listings. So just for the sake of clarity, so in the UK, there's no audit requirement. So for the ESEF file, it's voluntary assurance. But obviously in the EU, it's mandatory assurance or mandatory audit, depending on the national competent authorities kind of overall approach. So I think it raises a question here, and it raises a kind of communication challenge, because what you're actually getting is different levels of assurance and different places that these audit reports and assurance reports are across the EU. So as a user, it's actually quite unclear what you're getting, and what work has been done, and where to find all of the information. So a couple of the companies that we looked at, and there's an example in the report, highlighted and gave a bit of narrative within the annual report around what work the auditors had done, and what work the audit committee had done, and just sort of explained where to find all of the information to get that understanding of the assurance that they were getting on the file. And I think that's going to be quite useful for users, because it's not super clear from what you see. And you'll see as well, if you look at that XBRL filings .org as well, particularly where there's an assurance opinion outside of the annual report itself, it doesn't come across in the in the viewer, for example. So just think about the communications and get the benefit of having that assurance by telling people about it.
Okay,
and Dee, if I jump in there, just to reiterate the point that Daniel made as well, that in Ireland, IASA have kind of made it clear that it is the statutory financial statements that are subject to ESEF here. So it's the one audit report and the one document for our purposes in Ireland, based on the communication that we've had from the regulator on that as well. So just I'd like users to have that in the back of their mind when they are looking at other territories, because there are nuances between the law and the different territories as well. And unfortunately, the market that we always look to first for comparators is the UK, but in one of the first kind of evidence of Brexit, they've gone a slightly different way on this aspect of it. So I kind of advise caution on looking, and be sure to kind of bear the Irish position in mind all the time.
Sure. Thank you, Fiona, and very helpful. Just one last question then. I'm not sure who can answer it. It's in relation to the tagging conversion requirements for interim reports?
Oh, in the UK, we definitely have seen a few files that have come through with quarterly tagging. It is an annual report requirement, not a quarterly report requirement. So, I mean, I think if your storage mechanism it accepts the tagged files, then I think you're probably free to do it. But I'm not sure it's much use to do quarterlies because no one's going to be consuming them because they're not done en masse. And so yeah, it's an annual report challenge at the moment.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, well, that's it on the questions. Again, I want to thank everybody, Thomas, Carleen, Fiona, and Daniel, for their input. I hope everybody found it useful. And I will just say, you know, we are still, I suppose, working through issues with ESEF. If you do have queries, I would encourage you to go back to your auditors. The auditors have a working group with IASA, and we are also liaising with the Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment. So any issues, we certainly are working those out. So I really do want to thank you for joining us. I hope it was useful. We'll send you on the slides, and I think definitely have a look at that xbrl.org for examples and that. So many thanks to everybody, and thank you.